The question is a simple one. Did the police ever have a real suspect for the Black Dahlia murder? The answer is not simple at all. Yes, they did. In fact, they had too many. They had dozens of real suspects, hundreds of maybes, and thousands of dead ends. But the problem was never a lack of names. The problem was a storm of chaos, corruption, and confusion that swallowed the investigation whole. It was a case that was doomed from the first hour. It all started on January 15, 1947. A woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her young daughter in the Limerick Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was a quiet, undeveloped area. She saw something in the weeds off the side of the sidewalk. At first she thought it was a discarded store mannequin broken in half, but as she got closer she realized it was a body. It was the body of a woman. But this wasn't just a body, it was a grotesque display. The woman was naked, pale white, and drained of all blood. Her body had been cut in two at the waist with surgical precision. Her intestines were tucked neatly beneath her buttocks. There were cuts and bruises all over her body. Her face was the worst part. The killer had sliced her mouth from ear to ear, creating a permanent, horrifying grin known as a Glasgow smile. The body had been posed. One arm was bent over her head, the other was held out. Her legs were spread apart. This was not a murder done in a fit of rage. This was a statement. A piece of brutal public art. The police arrived, and right away, the investigation began to fall apart. Before a proper perimeter could be established, a crowd gathered. Reporters, photographers, and curious neighbors swarmed the scene. They trampled potential evidence. They took pictures from every angle. The scene was contaminated almost immediately. This was the first major failure in a long line of them. The victim was soon identified. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She was an aspiring actress, though she'd never had a real role. She was a drifter, moving between Florida, Massachusetts, and California. She had a reputation. A man found her beautiful. She wore black clothes, had dark hair, and apparently liked the movie The Blue Dahlia, which was out at the time. The press, in their hunger for a catchy name, dubbed her the Black Dahlia. The name stuck, and in a way it overshadowed the real person. Elizabeth Short, the young woman with hopes and problems, disappeared. The Black Dahlia, the mythical victim, took her place. The Los Angeles Police Department in the 1940s was not the professional organization we think of today. It was riddled with corruption, payoffs were common, detectives were often overworked, under-resourced, and prone to cutting corners. The Black Dahlia case was the biggest story in the country. The pressure to solve it was immense, and that pressure made things worse. The first real suspect was the man who last saw her alive. His name was Robert "Red" Manley. He was a married salesman who had picked up Elizabeth Short while she was hitchhiking in San Diego a few days before her murder. They spent some time together. He said she was just a friend, that he was helping her out. He dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on the evening of January 9th. He said she was going to meet her sister. She walked into the hotel lobby and he drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short. Naturally, the police focused on Manley. They questioned him for hours. He was given 2 lie detector tests. He passed both. His story seemed to check out. He had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. After a while, the police let him go. He was a good first suspect, an obvious one, but he wasn't the guy. This was a dead end, but a necessary one. The police had to start with him. The investigation then spiraled out of control. The media sensationalism was unbelievable. Newspapers printed rumors as facts. They published details of Elizabeth's personal life, painting her as a promiscuous tease who led men on. This narrative, true or not, made it seem like she had a long list of potential enemies. Tips poured in from all over the country, the police were swamped, and then the killer started to play games. About a week after the body was found, James Richardson, the editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, received a package. Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's belongings: her birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. The items had been cleaned with gasoline, wiping away any fingerprints. The sender had also cut out words from newspapers and magazines to create a taunting note. It read, "Here are Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Another letter did arrive. It was another messy collection of cut-out words. It said, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." The killer, or someone pretending to be the killer, was communicating. He was enjoying the attention. The police and the press were eating it up. This only added to the public frenzy. The investigation became a swamp of false confessions. Over the course of the next few years, more than 50 people, mostly men, confessed to the murder. Each confession had to be investigated. Each one took time and resources away from legitimate leads. Most were quickly dismissed as attention seekers or people with mental health issues. One man, a soldier named Joseph DeMai, gave a detailed confession, but his story kept changing. He seemed to be getting his facts from the newspapers. The police eventually realized he was lying. He was just another distraction. So, who were the real suspects? The ones the police seriously considered? There were several, and they fall into a few different categories. First, there was the circle of people Elizabeth Short knew in Los Angeles. Mark Hansen was a prime suspect. His name was on the address book sent to the newspaper. He was a wealthy nightclub and movie theater owner. Elizabeth Short had stayed at his home for a short time, along with several other young women. Hansen claimed he had kicked her out. He seemed to have a complicated relationship with her. Some said he was obsessed with her and that she had rejected his advances. That gave him a motive. He also had powerful connections in the city, which could have helped him avoid serious scrutiny. The police questioned him, but he had an alibi. They never had enough to charge him. He remains one of the more plausible suspects. Then came the medical suspects. The way Elizabeth Short's body was bisected was clean. It was a hemicorprectomy, a procedure that requires significant anatomical knowledge. Whoever did this likely had medical training. This led the police to look at doctors. One of the first was Dr. Walter Bayley. He was a surgeon who lived just one block from the lot where the body was found. His house was for sale, and he had moved out shortly before the murder. But there was another connection. Dr. Bayley's daughter was a friend of Elizabeth Short's sister. It was a small, strange link. But the most suspicious thing about Dr. Bayley was that he was suffering from a degenerative brain disease. His mind was deteriorating, and he died in January 1948, almost exactly a year after the murder. Did he kill Elizabeth Short in a fit of dementia-fueled rage and then die before he could be properly investigated? It's a theory, but there was no physical evidence to link him to the crime. Another doctor, Patrick O'Reilly, was also on the police radar. He was known to be a violent alcoholic. His secretary told police that he had been with a woman who looked like Elizabeth Short around the time of the murder. O'Reilly went on a bender and couldn't account for his time. He was a person of interest, but like so many others, the trail went cold. But the most famous, and for many, the most compelling medical suspect is Dr. George Hodel. His story is a Hollywood nightmare all by itself. Hodel was a brilliant and charismatic doctor who ran a venereal disease clinic in Los Angeles. He had a genius-level IQ. He was also a surrealist art enthusiast, friends with people like the artist Man Ray. He was known for hosting wild parties at his unique, Frank Lloyd Wright-designed home. He was also a man with a very dark side. In 1949, 2 years after the Dahlia murder, Hodel's own teenage daughter, Tamar, accused him of incest. The trial was a media sensation. Hodel was acquitted, but his reputation was destroyed. During this time, the police became very interested in him as a suspect for the Black Dahlia murder. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office secretly planted microphones in Hodel's home. They recorded his conversations for several weeks in early 1950. The transcripts of those recordings are chilling. Hodel is heard talking to himself and to visitors. At one point he says, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." His secretary had died of an apparent overdose, which many now believe was a murder. He also made references to performing abortions and other illegal medical procedures. He talked about paying off police officers. The recordings painted a picture of a man who believed he was above the law. The police were building a case. They felt they were close. But just as they were about to arrest him, George Hodel abruptly left the country. He moved to Asia and lived there for the next 40 years. He never returned to the United States to live permanently. Did he flee because he knew the police were closing in? It certainly looks that way. The case against George Hodel was largely forgotten until his own son, a retired lap-dead homicide detective named Steve Hodel, began his own investigation in the late 1990s. Steve Hodel became convinced that his father was not only the Black Dahlia killer, but also a serial killer responsible for several other murders in Los Angeles, and possibly even the Zodiac murders in Northern California. Steve Hodel has written several books laying out his case. He points to his father's medical knowledge. He found photos of a woman in his father's private collection who he believes is Elizabeth Short. He discovered that his father owned a property in the same neighborhood where the body was found. He argues that the style of the murder, the posing of the body, reflects his father's interest in surrealist art, particularly the work of Man Ray. A handwriting expert even concluded that it was highly probable that George Hodel's handwriting matched the taunting notes sent by the killer. The case Steve Hodel presents is incredibly detailed and persuasive. To him, and to many others, his father is the killer. The lapdad has never officially named George Hodel as the prime suspect, but in 2003, after a meeting with Steve Hodel, the head of the DA's office said that if George Hodel were alive today, he would have enough evidence to prosecute him. George Hodel died in 1999. For many, this is as close to a solution as we will ever get. He was a real suspect, perhaps the most real of them all, and it seems the police knew it, but they let him slip away. There was another very serious suspect, one that the district attorney's office pursued aggressively, much to the annoyance of the lapdad. His name was Leslie Dillon. Dillon was a former bellhop and an aspiring writer. He contacted a police informant, a psychiatrist named Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, who was obsessed with the case. Dillon claimed to know details about the murder that hadn't been made public. He seemed to be toying with the idea of writing a book about it. DeRiver believed Dillon was the killer. The DA's investigators took Dillon into custody and held him in a hotel room for days, interrogating him. This was a secret investigation, hidden from the lapdad. The lead investigator for the DA believed Dillon was not the killer himself, but that he was connected to the killer. He believed Dillon was part of a circle that included Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner. The theory was that Hansen, possibly with help, had killed Elizabeth Short, and Dillon knew all about it. This created a massive conflict between the DA's office and the lapdad. The lapdad chief of police was furious that the DA was running a shadow investigation. The lapdad publicly cleared Leslie Dillon, claiming he had an alibi. They essentially sabotaged the DA's efforts. Was this because the lapdad was incompetent, or was it because they were protecting someone, maybe Mark Hansen, who had friends in high places? This infighting was another critical failure. A promising lead, whether it was Dillon himself or the people he was connected to, was destroyed by political turf wars. Leslie Dillon was a real suspect, one that a branch of law enforcement took very seriously, but he too vanished back into obscurity. So we have Manley, the last man to see her. We have Hansen, the spurned admirer. We have the doctors, Bayley and Hodel, with their surgical skills and dark secrets. We have Dillon, the mysterious insider. These were not just random names. These were men with connections to the victim, with possible motives, with the means to commit the crime. The police had real suspects, so why was the case never solved? The answer lies in the botched investigation itself. It was a perfect storm of failure. First, the media. The press was not a partner in the investigation. It was an obstacle. By printing every lurid detail and unconfirmed rumor, they created a narrative that was impossible to control. They turned Elizabeth Short into a caricature and the murder into a public spectacle. The killer's letters to the press showed that he was feeding on this attention. The media frenzy also led to the flood of false tips and confessions, burying the real detectives under a mountain of useless information. Second, the police department. The lapdad of 1947 was not equipped to handle a case of this magnitude. The crime scene was compromised from the very beginning. Evidence was lost. The infighting between the lapdad and the DA's office showed a complete lack of cooperation. There were strong suspicions of corruption. Key suspects like Mark Hansen and George Hodel were powerful men. Did they use their influence to avoid proper investigation? The fact that the police bugged Hodel's house but then let him leave the country suggests either a massive screw-up or something more sinister. They had him talking on tape and they still let him go. Third, the lack of technology. This is a huge factor. In 1947, there was no DNA evidence. Fingerprinting was a useful tool, but the killer was smart enough to wipe everything clean. Forensic science was in its infancy. If this murder happened today, police would likely have found DNA on the body, on the letters, or at the location where she was actually killed. The investigation was limited by the tools at the time, and finally, there was Elizabeth Short herself. She was a transient, she didn't have a stable home or a steady job, she moved in and out of different social circles. She knew a lot of people, but few people knew her well. Her life in the weeks leading up to her murder was a mystery. The police called this her missing week, the time between when Manley dropped her off at the Biltmore and when her body was found. Who did she meet? Where did she go? No one knows for sure. This made it incredibly difficult to trace her final movements and identify who she was with. So, did the police have a real suspect? Yes. They had George Hodel, a man who fit the profile perfectly, who had the skills, who had a dark history, and who basically confessed on a police wiretap before fleeing the country. They had Mark Hansen, a man with a clear motive of jealousy and obsession. They had Leslie Dillon, who knew too much. They had other plausible names on their lists. The tragedy of the Black Dahlia case is not that the killer was a ghost who left no clues. The tragedy is that the clues were there, the suspects were real, but the system failed. The investigation was a chaotic mess from day one. It was a circus of reporters, corrupt cops, political battles, and public hysteria. The killer wasn't a brilliant mastermind who committed the perfect crime, he was just a man. A brutal, sadistic man who was lucky enough to commit his crime at a time and place where the authorities were more interested in fighting each other and feeding the media than in doing the hard, quiet work of solving a murder. The file remains open. It is the most famous unsolved murder in American history. And it stays that way not because of a lack of suspects, but because of an abundance of failure. The police had their man, probably more than once. They just couldn't see him through the smoke.